Finally, I've managed to get a Russian guest. He has an interesting background as a scientist who's known for his work in biochemistry, biomedical sciences, and his research in the field of DNA genealogy and the study of history of species through DNA molecular history. And most importantly, he is one of the two scientists who published a paper called Re-examining the Out of Africa Theory and the Origin of Caucasoids in Light of DNA Genealogy. Rebecca Kahn is a geneticist who since the 80s has been pushing the mitochondrial Eve story, which tells us that all humans are genetically descended from a single African mother who lived 200,000 years ago. This is the foundation of the Out of Africa mythology. They claim Homo sapiens emerged in Africa relatively recently and migrated to all parts of the earth. Although lacking substantial evidence, the Out of Africa myth is widely disseminated and pushed as truth. Although lacking substantial evidence, the Out of Africa myth is widely disseminated and pushed as truth. Before Out of Africa, it was Darwin to propose that all humans had in common an ancestor who lived in Africa because he thought African apes had a close evolutionary relationship with humans. Because he thought African apes had a close evolutionary relationship with humans. Because he thought African apes had a close evolutionary relationship with humans. Nearly all contemporary American and European scientists are proponents of the Out of Africa dogma because, as we know, if a scientist's research is not in line with the political narrative, they'll receive no funding and be ostracized. If a scientist's research is not in line with the political narrative, they'll receive no funding and be ostracized. If a scientist's research is not in line with the political narrative, they'll receive no funding and be ostracized. However, ancestry and genetics of different human groups is much more complicated and not so simple. We'll discuss quite a bit in this extended interview. I do not agree with everything he says as much as still in the realm of mainstream, but I will say it's extremely difficult finding scientists who are brave enough to tell the truth when it comes to human origins, evolution, race, and the history of European peoples. It's extremely difficult finding scientists who are brave enough to tell the truth when it comes to human origins, evolution, race, and the history of European peoples.
So I wrote a paper to that journal, and the paper was banned. So I wrote a paper to that journal, and the paper was banned. So it was not allowed to publish.
Well, Anatoly, I wanted to switch gears a little bit. You brought up propaganda science, and it was in 2012 when I first came across your research re-examining the Out of Africa theory, and I was really excited about that because no one touches this dogma in America because it wouldn't be politically correct. So how did you first get interested in examining the Out of Africa story?
I will tell you, not in America. It's the same, essentially same in Russia right now, because it's kind of very orthodox theory. It's kind of very orthodox theory. Russians, in much less extent, believe in it. However, the Academy of Science has accepted the dogma. You're absolutely right. You have to be really independent to do studies like that. Now, how I came to it. First, I thought that indeed it is proven that modern people, anatomically modern people, came out of Africa about 70,000 years ago. Well, how it was explained in all main academic journals. And then when I just believed, I didn't look into the matter seriously. I just thought, well, they're professionals. Of course they know what they're talking about. I just thought, well, they're professionals. Of course they know what they're talking about. I just thought, well, they're professionals. Of course they know what they're talking about. But then at some point, I decided to look on which evidence it is based. And I took the first journals, papers, from which the first was published essentially in 1987, and I was terrified. There was no base whatsoever. Mm-hmm. It was all conjectures, stretches, guesses, and nothing else. In fact, the abstract of the very first paper in 1987 says it belonged probably to a woman who lived probably in Africa, probably 200,000 years ago.
Mitochondrial Eve, right?
Yeah, they studied mitochondria at that time. So everything was probably or supposedly. Then the paper was denounced. In fact, 4 years after, and co-authors published a second paper. The first may not already not among the authors of the second paper. However, it was too late because the media, as you can imagine, they just went nuts when the paper was first published. It was too late because the media, as you can imagine, they just went nuts when the paper was first published. Great, where our ancestors are from Africa. And it sounds so nice. Well, indeed, because we will feel guilt. We feel guilt before a black color people because of many years of exploitation, slavery. However, it should be based on real reason, not on made-up reason and full-up apology. So I decided to go into it. And my profession allowed me to do it because I graduated a chair of chemical kinetics in Moscow University. And the head of our chair was a Nobel Prize winner, Semyonov, who actually the only one chemist in the Soviet Union and Russia who won the Nobel Prize. So I was his student. I got pretty good school. I wrote many textbooks on kinetics of chemical and biological reactions. Kinetics is a science on reactions at velocities, how fast or slow reactions are and why. So it was easy for me to move that science to the DNA, to mutations in the DNA, and to see where mutations were, arose, what time, where probably. And so I looked closely into the matter on Africans. And it turned out there is not a single proof of Africans, that our ancestors came from Africa.
Yeah.
Not a single one. There is not a single proof of Africans, that our ancestors came from Africa.
Yeah.
Not a single one. And I described it in a few papers, and they followed very closely, and sometimes really ridiculous how they explain it. I mean, we assign some index to different tribes. So index A was ascribed to the Africans. So now when we find something with an index A, they say, okay, look, there's the Africans because they're from Africa. Say, how about if we set a W to the same mutation? We still will be from Africa. So there is a circling argument. Everything which is A in a tribe, it is African. However, we have to look into the matter more deeply. So it turned out that our evolution tree comes from, it would be not scientific term to say from monkeys, but from gorilla, from orangutan, from chimpanzee, from macaque, where plenty of mutations, irreversible mutations in our bodies, in our DNA, which we acquired from those monkeys, so to speak, millions and millions of years ago. And then the evolution tree went from, and we have in our DNA, there are more than 90% of the same mutations in the DNA as in a chimpanzee. So when we take a chimpanzee from the zoo and run a DNA test, it's more than 90% mutations as in us. So they're pretty stable. However, we don't have mutations from our African friends. From a black Africans, we don't have mutations. From chimpanzee 5 million years ago, we have plenty. From the Africans, and the Homo sapiens was kind of, as we assume, arose about 200,000 years ago. Much less time, we don't have. And so I went again more and more deep into the matter, and I started to analyze publications, and now most of them which mention Africa, kind of the first phrase is, as it is well established, or is it well known, our ancestors came out from Africa. It's already dogma.
Yeah, it is.
It's already taken as it's postulated as a fact. No, it's not. And interesting that now we have more and more papers on studying genome, which is a very advanced field. Well, when we look in the genome, it contains millions and millions of mutations, irreversible. They form a pattern. So scientists compare genome in one part of the world with genome in other parts of the world and see how much similar or different those mutations are. So now when they study Africa, they put as a base that anatomically modern people came out of Africa. And they bent all the data, I know, consciously or unconsciously, maybe to get a good grant, maybe something, people are weak. They can easily be bought, many of them, with the grant money.
Yeah.
If you apply for a grant that our ancestor didn't come from Africa, you will not get any grant.
That's right.
But if you file a grant that you're going to prove it even better, you get lots of money. If you file a grant that you're going to prove it even better, you get lots of money. So that's why it's a crime indeed in science. When science brain is now bought, is purchased for grants when it's politically sound. It should not be done like this. However, that's what happens. Now, imagine last week a paper came out, very fresh, when authors of the paper studying genome, and they want to go, deeper into the matter. They want not only to prove that people came from Africa, it's given for them. That was again the first phrase of the paper. It is well known. They wanted to look into which directions they came from Africa. And they consider two ways, either through Ethiopia, the southern way, or through Egypt, the northern way. Now imagine how they showed it. They took genome of Egyptians, African they consider, and they took genomes of people outside of Africa and showed that people in Egypt show similarity with people outside of Africa. And to them, it's a proof that the people came from Africa by northern way.
Yeah, and they think there was a lot of interbreeding going on, and I'd
Sure.
say, yeah, some, not all.
So it could be the same way that it could be, it's known that lots of them came to Egypt. So it could be the same way that it could be, it's known that lots of them came to Egypt. When there was Islamization of Egypt in about 9th century A.D., plenty of Arabs came to Africa and brought them their mutations with them. So, and they found that in Ethiopia, much less mutations with an outside world, and the southern way wouldn't work. Of course, if they look at Yemen, which is just around the strait, they have a completely different genetics than in Ethiopia. So you can't even consider, you don't even need an even genome to say that. So in such a primitive approach, they claim that they showed northern way, they showed direction. And mass media already agreed. Look, it's a great advancement in science. Now we already know which way they came out of Africa. It's really, I can't even find a proper word to describe it. Races, of course, in all time, we had, as I see it, we have two principal races. We had a Black Africa. However, people who are not out of Africa, but they lived probably forever since millions of years ago outside of Africa. By the way, Neanderthal was not a black-skinned person. By the way, Neanderthal was not a black-skinned person. By the way, Neanderthal was not a black-skinned person. Neanderthal was a fair skin and reddish hair, among other things. He was not African. However, he lived only like 300,000 to 400,000 years ago. So he didn't come out of Africa. And so not necessarily that everything is attached to Africa. And it's a great continent, but not for everything. So now the thing is that the common ancestor of all non-Africans in our world arose only about 65,000 years ago. Because when we study the DNA in all people on our planet, except the Africans, all of them, they coalesce to the common ancestor for all of them who lived about 65,000 years ago. So since it was the only person which technically the father of all the non-African population, it could be only of one race, right? He was the only one who survived. So that particular person who survived, of course, he was not alone. A lot of people around him, they died out, and only his offspring survived. That's why he was a common ancestor. That's why all the DNA mutations go to him. We don't know his name, but evidence 65,000 years ago. But he was the only person who survived in our generations. He had only one race. And then out of that one race came, during the 65,000 years, came, Chinese, American Indians, that Finns and Swedes and British and Russians and the Mexicans. And so all people of different skin colors and hair colors and everything, in fact, they had as one ancestor that one person. But you know what the problem is? There are so many established dogmas in linguistic and history and archaeology. There are so many established dogmas in linguistic and history and archaeology. And what's happening in archaeology? It's a great science. However, they're very restricted with their interpretations. So imagine they found some spear in one part of the world, a similar spear in the other part of the world. So clearly they're similar. Maybe it was a trophy. They don't know. And that's why they conjectured something. They just came up with an explanation. Explanation, not necessarily correct one. However, when the people with good authority expressed it, it goes to the textbooks and became a dogma. However, when the people with good authority expressed it, it goes to the textbooks and became a dogma.
Well, it's just like in America, their Ice Age Europeans were the oldest here. We have remains of that, but no one talks about who the true Native Americans are.
Of course, it is very painful when you try to explain through scientific papers to linguists, to historians, to many others, specialties, that the situation is different. That's what the DNA shows. It is very painful. It is very painful when you try to explain to linguists, to historians, to many others, specialties, that the situation is different. That's what the DNA shows. They react very painfully because their career is based on those not necessarily correct interpretations. They react very painfully because their career is based on those not necessarily correct interpretations. Their grants they work on right now are not necessarily correct anymore. So do you think they're going to say, no, take back that money? We don't need it because we change our view. Never. They will continue to fight to death for that, things they actually base their scientific career on. They will continue to fight to death for that, things they actually base their scientific career on. And they look for homeland. It's a very respected area to look for homeland in linguistics. But when they work with the DNA, clearly there was no any homeland. Languages don't appear in one isolated place. Languages don't appear in one isolated place. Languages don't appear in one isolated place. They don't even branch from one isolated place. They always conversion and diversion, and they go like fluctuating, they move around, and there is no homeland. It's clear because all that what I mentioned now, I mentioned 5, I was 25, it was just a transition points.
Just a couple more questions for you since you know so much. I wanted to know from a biological standpoint if modern humans today were to basically, we're race mixing a lot, we're outbreeding certain traits until there's going to be possibly no visible race that exists anymore. Would we be destroying human biodiversity to a point where it could be catastrophic, or could we become something else entirely?
This is exaggerated a lot, this saying. In fact, there are population geneticists which calculate that in about 30, 40, 50 years, everything would be equal, would come to the equilibrium, and it will be all mixed up. Not at all. It would have happened if we would be absolutely promiscuous. If we don't care whom we make an offspring with. But it doesn't happen that way. American Indians, they marry mainly American Indian women, and vice versa. Now, the Russians mainly marry Russian women. If you go to villages, particularly remote, you would see many Mongolians or Africans or whoever, actually none. We are very selective. We are very selective. We are very selective with whom we choose being our partner. I'm talking about marriage.
Yeah.
We pick our own people. That's in our genes, it's in our brain, and that's why it continues that way. There is very little mixing and interbreeding.
Because you see, in America, they push it so much nowadays. That's a modern thing, though.
I know, the American is always advanced in everything, and good and bad. And so, indeed, it is kind of politically correct. Because before it was, as you know, of course, there was a lot of harassment for that interracial marriage. But still, even when you take statistically, you take 200 plus million people in America and count how many of them they were interracial marriage, it would be probably a fraction of 1%, even less. So we talk about cities. Big cities. We talk about Los Angeles, we talk about New York City, Washington, D.C., Boston, but it's not in in the Midwest.
Yeah.
It's not in many other places. People there are much more conservative in that regard. I'm not saying it's good or bad. It's just a fact. We choose our own people. That's what, so far, it's a main denominator in our behavior. Of course, there are more adventurous people. There are more kind of, breakheads. There are more genuine love, of course, it happens. But again, it's kind of a little.
Well, I wanted to ask you, too, from a genetic standpoint, since we do choose our own people, and now it seems, the governments are pushing, mass immigration into Europe and into America, and it's this kind of multiracial, multicultural. Has this ever existed before?
However, I believe generally, people live pretty much, in isolation from other clans or tribes. Now, of course, it's shattered. Now is globalization. Now is globalization. Now is globalization. What is a not very good thing, which I don't really like, is that not only good things spread around. There are not very good things spread around. We have terror. We have terrorists. We have a lot of, those peaceful invasions to other countries from aside. Of course, those poor people, they want to be safe. They want to have a better future. However, there is erosion, huge erosion of habits and traditions.
That's right.
Lifestyle in many countries.
And now, unfortunately, white people aren't having as many babies, so that's another problem. Our population could be replaced.
And I know statistics with alcoholics, and I know that again, in terms of political correctness, it is a disease. Alcoholism, right?
Yeah.
It is a disease. People don't have that. They're not guilty. They become alcoholics. It's just a disease. Forget about environment. At the same time, there were a number of genetic studies, or not only genetics, maybe you can call it biochemical, maybe call it even social studies, when twins are sons of an alcoholic person, they were separated at birth. And there is, I don't remember the number, like a 70 or maybe 80% likelihood they'll also become alcoholics. In spite of the environment.
Yeah.
In spite of great care, in spite of everything, there is a good chance they are more prone to substance abuse.
Yeah, genes are a powerful thing. Well, I had last question for you before I let you go. Where do you think human evolution is heading next? Because we don't just stop evolving, right?
Well, I think it's heading to a great future.
We're not
Ser-
de-evolving. It seems like people are becoming dumber. you know.
Seriously, unfortunately, progress is tremendous in weaponry. Unfortunately, whatever came as a progress was turned to a killing machine. Whatever happened, people invented wheel. Now we see tanks and artillery things, killing machine and artillery things,
Where do you think human evolution is heading next?
killing machine and artillery things.
Yeah, I forgot to ask, how accurate are those DNA genealogy tests anyway? They seem a little fishy.
Now comes interpretation. An interpretation could be flawed. An interpretation could be flawed. An interpretation could be flawed. That's a different story. So that's why when responsible scientists, when they interpret, they always look for another explanations. And they go for a cross-examination, like good detective. Detective also, there are some good and not good. They're impulsive or they're not. They're meticulous. So same thing in science. It takes brain training to be really responsible for what you're doing.
Is that something that you offer? Do you have a lab that offers those kinds of tests?
I'm setting up a lab in Moscow to run two things. One, to have a mass testing now, and the second direction of that lab would be excavated DNA, Asian DNA.
You know, if we did come from Africa, then what's the problem if white people want to live there? Then what's the problem if we process the resources? After all, we're giving billions in aid to Africans. When first presented in 1987, the Out of Africa model was new, modern, and told humans about their distant origins. It even presented a biblical connection.
Peaceful invasions.
It even presented a biblical connection.
Peaceful invasions.
This model was simple and made science reporting easy and fun. It implied the brotherhood of all humankind and was politically correct. It was idealistic and too good to be true. It is so popular because people want it to be true.
Peaceful invasions.
It is so popular because people want it to be true. In the end, the Out of Africa idea of human evolution is dominant among anthropologists, perhaps because most fossils were found there, because of the commitment to a single origin scenario, and finally because of cultural demands that all humans be of equal descent. While the Out of Africa model does incorporate certain fossil, genetic, and archaeological evidence, the same categories of evidence also prove the complete opposite. Yet if you read the evidence, the Out of Africa model is not a legitimate explanation for the emergence and subsequent spread of Homo sapiens. I'm always shocked that some researchers can understand how history and science is used for political purposes, but then they don't investigate further, questioning the mainstream account of what we've been told, still accepting the allowed version.
Peaceful invasions. 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 Peaceful invasions.